Leprosy of the skin was generally a death sentence until an antibiotic was discovered in recent times. Terrible affliction, worse than a bad case of acne. You might blow your nose one day and you find that you don't have a nose anymore. People's bodily parts fell off. Jesus, we are told, was gutted when this leper broke away from his compound to seek healing. He was so moved with compassion that he stretched out his hand, touched him, and cured him completely. We might complain about 14-day quarantines, but in people until 100 years ago were exiled to islands for a permanent quarantine. Damien de Voister, a Belgian priest, volunteered to go to the island of Molokai in the Pacific. There, he established a leprosarium, built a church. There was a movie made of his life. He was canonized. The church recognized his heroic virtue. He wasn't sent there by his bishop. No bishop would hate a priest off that much that they'd send them to assure a certain death. But he volunteered to go there because he knew these people needed a shepherd. Why should they suffer in misery alone? Somebody told me they saw that movie, Damien of Molokai, in one of the cinemas, the Dendy cinema, and came away crying. I said, why? And they said, well, I wondered, what have I done with my life compared to what this man has done? And although he's been raised to the altars of the church as a saint, he had his critics at the time. In fact, there was a Scots Presbyterian, Reverend Dr. Hyde, who wrote a letter to the Sydney Morning Herald, a scathing letter about Damien de Voister. The Herald published it. Who decides what gets published? Has anything changed? In this letter, written in 1890, Dr. Hyde maintains that Damien was no saintly do-gooder. This is the year after the man had died, Damien de Voister. But he was a coarse, dirty, headstrong bigot. And there's worse to come. He was not a pure man in his relations with women. His leprosy was due to his vices and his carelessness. Well, there was a famous author in Sydney at the time. He was slowly dying of tuberculosis, which is another one of those diseases which was a death sentence until recent times, generally. His name was Robert Louis Stevenson. I don't know about you, but I enjoyed his swashbuckling pirate story of Treasure Island. Long John Silver and Billy Bones and the Black Spot. Anyway, Stevenson was also a Scots Presbyterian, but he took umbrage at this letter that he read in the Herald, and he decided he was going to go and do his homework, find out for himself about this man. He went to the island, he met the nuns that had gone there in the latter years of Damien's time to help him in his work. One of those religious sisters is also now a canonised saint of the church. But he went further. He actually met the lepers. And then he went and prayed at Father Damien's grave. And then he came home, and I don't know how long he had to quarantine. But anyway, he went into his room muttering, took up his pen and wrote a letter defending Damien of Molokai. But the letter was too hot to handle for the Herald, and they refused to print it. Has anything changed? What gets printed and what doesn't? Anyway, it was printed overseas, and I'd just like to share with you what he said in this letter. He took apart Dr. Hyde's criticisms. He took them one at a time in his righteous anger, and this is what he had to say. You say Damien was dirty, but at least he was with his flock. Whereas you, Reverend Dr. Hyde, a very clean man, was sitting at your table eating your food in your very clean house. You say that Damien was headstrong. Well, I thank God for his strong head and his strong heart. You say that Damien was bigoted. Well, I say he was a believer whose faith has made him a hero and a role model. You, sir, will be forgotten shortly after your death, but Damien's memory will live on. How prophetic. They made a movie about him. He's a canonised saint. He said one day there'll be a devil's advocate to try to prove that Damien was a vicious man. That's part of the canonisation process. There's always heroic virtues, but there's always a devil's advocate to argue the opposite before someone is declared to be a saint of heroic virtue. Robert Louis Stevenson prophesied that Damien of Molokai would one day be a saint. The only reason we still talk about Reverend Dr. Hyde is because he had such a hide as to criticise Damien of Molokai. He's not remembered in a favourable way. Stevenson concludes his pamphlet by arguing that Father Damien was a father figure for all mankind, everyone of goodwill, not just his own flock. And, Dr. Hyde, he was your father too, if God had given you the grace to see it. What a wonderful, wonderful defence of a man living Christian charity and following the example of Jesus in today's gospel, who was not afraid to touch the leper. Damien held the hands of lepers who were dying. Yes, he eventually contracted the disease, but he knew how important that touch was. A human hand stretched out at the right time, so necessary. And we who are so self-indulgent, oh yes, we look for comfort and consolations and caresses and massages or whatever. But, you know, during COVID we've had to rethink our priorities, but there is some touch that is very important. In the Eucharist, Jesus touches us as food. He comes into the depths of our being, the depths of our misery, in order to do his surgery, to lift us from our misery according to our desire and our hunger for him. our need for him. We need to work on that. Maybe COVID has helped us to think about our priorities and our need for the human touch of Jesus. And just on that note, I don't think you're actually going to be signed with the ashes on Wednesday at Ash Wednesday Mass. I think they're going to be sprinkled on the head. But that apparently was how it was done in earlier times. But next year, hopefully, we can look forward to boldly wearing that sign of the ashes on our foreheads. Please remember that it's a day of abstaining from surplus or excess eating. Abstaining from meat and fasting from excess eating is the proper way to put it. If we can. If we need meat, well, we need it, but we can certainly cut back. No snacking, that sort of thing. We need to remember during Lent to do works of mercy. Perhaps that's what COVID is calling us to do. Think of those who have been housebound, those who haven't had that interaction, human interaction, to visit those people. That indeed would be a Good Friday work of mercy on any Friday of the year when we keep in mind the Lord's Passion, but especially during the season of Lent.